Hello, and welcome to an episode of Mind Makes This World. I'm your host, Nathan Smith, and today I'm joined by Brandon Wilson. Brandon is an old friend of mine. We met as missionaries, in fact, in the San Joaquin Valley of California back in 2015, and we have been friends ever since. Brandon, a little bit about him. He has a Master's of Arts in Religious Studies from Rice University, specializing in esotericism and comparative religion, and he is currently a PhD student at Claremont Graduate University, studying comparative esotericism with a focus on Mormonism and temple worship. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. It's nice to chat.
Absolutely. I'm excited. I'm very excited because one of the big focuses of this podcast is to explore like practices from maybe contexts that people, especially modern people, might not be overly familiar with to develop emotional intelligence and maintain mental health. Meditation has been one of those really interesting subjects for me personally. I practice meditation for several years now. I have, and but as you might imagine, meditation I've drawn on mostly like Buddhism and yoga and like Indian and Southeast Asian traditions. But recently, I was surprised to learn that Christianity, Eastern and Western, has kind of a set of practices called contemplative prayer. I was hoping that you could talk to us today about one of those practices in Eastern Orthodox Christianity called Hesychasm. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that's a really broad it's a really broad topic,
Yeah,
right?
I imagine.
Spanning golly, almost 2000 years at this point. So hesychasm comes from the Greek word hesychia, which means silence or stillness. And, that word the connotation that word would give um would be a good word to put. When people think silence or stillness, they might mean like, oh, just being quiet or just, with nothing there. But in fact, for the hesychast, or the person who practices hesychasm, it's far from that. Quieting it's more of quieting the mind and the body, and having complete stillness, so that way they can achieve what they call theosis, and which we could of course get to later. But in essence, that's what hesychasm is all about. Is about quieting the mind, quieting the body, quieting the self, whatever it is that you want to call it. In Greek Orthodoxy, they call it the nous, which is just Greek for the mind. Quieting that down, so that way they can then climb the divine ladder and achieve theosis.
That's excellent. So it sounds to me like I don't want to be so comparative that I just sort of reduce hesychasm to like, oh, it's just Buddhism for Christians. Not by any means, but it sounds to me like it is kind of like a progressive technique, that it's
Yeah.
something that you practice for an extended period of time and that it has gradual changes and effects on you. That's very interesting to me. The idea of quieting the nous, the mind, to achieve theosis. Can you talk to us a little bit about like the method, like the particular methods that are used to quiet the mind?
So first of all, hesychasm historically, and for the most part even presently, is a monastic practice. Um, Recently there have been some monks and even some leaders such as Callistus Ware, who is a very predominant Eastern Orthodox theologian, very popular writer as well, who has tried to take hesychast practices and hesychast doctrines and tried to make them a bit more accessible to the wider public. But for the most part, throughout its history, it's been a strictly monastic practice. And so with that, you can imagine just the strict discipline that comes with those types, with the practice in general. Most of the time, hesychasm involves complete solitude. Sometimes it's within caves. Sometimes it's within hermitages. I mean, when I mean hermitages, I mean like, 5 by 5 rooms that are very small enclosed rooms. Um, there are some reports even of hesychasts that lived out in Turkey, this or in Istanbul area, that would go out into the mountain regions there and completely cave themselves in, with the exception of a little light hole, or a little hole that their disciples could then come and bring bread and water every day, and they would just sit there and do their contemplative practice of hesychasm, which primarily consists of sitting, though sometimes pacing was a part of the practice as well. A rosary was almost always involved. A rosary with beads that they would, rotate within their hand, and the mantra that is famously known as the Jesus prayer was always associated with it, which is Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you would sit in, sometimes there were some postures, such as, some of them actually had, some practices had physical postures, such as sitting with your hands, and you'd have to kind of arch your back a little ways back, and you'd have to keep that position. But postures weren't as, I guess you could say, it wasn't as rigid as a discipline as, say, some yogic practices within Hinduism, and even some Buddhist tantras. Most of the time it just consisted of just sitting, sometimes just sitting with your rosary, and sometimes eyes closed, eyes open, it doesn't matter, but you just try to quiet the mind through constant repetition of this mantra, which is Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And you constantly do it. And you constantly do it until you have essentially purified your mind and have reached God.
That's excellent. It's interesting to hear about this because again, to give the caveat that this is not me trying to reduce everything down to just like, oh, it's just Christian yoga. But it's really interesting, like down to like the use of a rosary to kind of focus your mind on your chanting. I mean, that's very similar to like the japa in yoga, the beads, 108 beads, and you use this for like chanting a mantra and the like. So I'm guessing then the effect of repeatedly chanting this prayer inwardly or even vocally, I guess, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Like, I'm guessing that focuses the mind then? Is that the mechanism that's being used?
Yes, absolutely. I should also continue, kind of lumping that in with that statement, with hesychasm as well. This contemplative practice is also not just part of hesychasm, but the liturgy is just as important. So going to church and participating in the divine liturgy, or with these people that would enclose themselves within their hermitages and actually cave themselves in, having someone bring the Eucharist to them every Sunday was paramount. So the Eucharist is first and foremost the most important factor, and particularly for the metaphysical aspects of hesychasm and what the Eucharist means, because without the liturgy and what it means, the contemplative practice of hesychasm is moot and void. So that is one factor I would say that makes it distinctly Christian and would differentiate it from I guess you could say reducing it to just like, oh, it's just it's just Christian tantra. It's like, well, not quite, because again, the divine hesychasm without the divine liturgy is not hesychasm anymore. So the divine liturgy is central to the hesychast practice, and then so as you're after you partake of the body and blood of Christ, then you can continue your contemplative practice. And if you're not partaking of the body and blood of Christ, you don't have a contemplative practice.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially considering that you said that the end goal, if we could call it that, of this practice is theosis, like a merging or a union with God. I imagine that the Eucharist would be a big part of this, the idea of consuming the flesh and the blood of Christ. Can you talk to us a little bit about, I understand that there's kind of like a three-tiered model of progression in hesychasm, that it begins with these Greek words catharsis, and then you move on to theoria, and then finally theosis. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the stages of progression from catharsis, theoria, and theosis not only are they done within the actual contemplative practice, but they're also done as stages of initiation to become a hieromonk. So somebody who is actually either leading a monastery, or even somebody who has achieved mastery of the hesychast practice, that you become a hieromonk, or you become, I guess you could say, divinized. They even have specific garbs, specific robes called schemas that demarcate stages in your progression. So you start out with the stages of catharsis, which are stages of purification. So it's just it's learning to purify your mind from distraction. So and this is where all monks would start. All beginning monks starting the stages of hesychasm would start. You start by learning to discipline the mind to not be distracted, because according to the hesychast and even just the broader Eastern Orthodox way of sin, they do not view the fall of Adam and Eve through the lens of original sin. So that's where one of the big demarcations between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism is that Augustine's notion of original sin became a canonized practice, became a canonized doctrine within Roman Catholicism, whereas Eastern Orthodoxy says no, not quite. So what sin is much more of, I guess you could say, it's chaos needing to be brought back. So in other words, a distracted mind is a chaotic mind that needs to be brought back into wholeness. And so the fall of Adam and Eve is just it's a fall from wholeness. It's a fall
That's
from a divine. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's shockingly similar to how like I've heard clinicians and therapists describe meditation is the funny thing where it's
Oh,
like your
yeah.
mind is like traveling in a million different directions. You feel like you're alienated from the world around you, or like you're contracted in and you don't want to like touch anything, or maybe even feel antagonistic to the world around you, or even just the feelings in your own body or your mind. It's surprising to me that like that in a sort of a pre-psychological, pre-scientific practice, if you will, that there is this sort of perennial concern for emotional health, for mental health, even. It's interesting to me too. I think especially the theoretical models that we use to sort of describe how these practices work and like what they're meant to achieve. Because I mean, like for example, in more like tantric practices in India, they talk a lot about like entrusting yourself to the cosmic mother, essentially to this Shakti that's the whole universe. Can you tell us a little bit about like I guess a little bit more, in fact, about the theoretical writings and the like that were meant to sort of describe what it's like to be, uh, I guess, proficient in hesychasm, like someone who has been doing hesychasm for years and years and years. What kind of experience could they expect?
So I mean, that's one of the big troubles, right? Is putting those types of things into words. That's what
Mm.
makes mystical experiences like this, first of all, appealing to a wider audience. And I mean, that's what made Hinduism so appealing during the 1960s, was just that it offered a much more, I guess you could say, an apophatic spirituality that had long been absent within Western Christianity, within the United States especially. But but within Eastern Orthodoxy, that's always been present. It's something that you experience, but you cannot put into words. But the way, I mean, so and that jumps right into theoria, right? So the next stage after you've purified the mind, it's you go from catharsis to theoria, which is illumination of the mind. It's when you begin to see reality. That's I mean, of course, all these are really poor words, because then you start thinking about it very rigidly, or perhaps much worse, platonically. or actually even worse than that, Aristotelianly. but um, but it's learning to see with the heart, as they say. It's learning to see with the heart, and what you see is that you yourself have now become Christ. You and Christ are now one, which is, again, coming back to the whole liturgical side of this, being able to partake of the body and blood of Christ, and then being able to realize it through contemplation.
That's a super
And
interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
well, no, it's coming. So the realization is just that notion is, and then that again leads to, and then as you come to achieve that through more discipline. So once you have that illumination, it's something that doesn't come easily. So again, along the stages of becoming a hiero monk, you once you get that illumination, you achieve a next stage, which is now you need to learn to have this illumination, to be able to achieve this illumination almost instantaneously. So in other words, it's awakening the Christ-like nature with you almost immediately after entering this contemplation. And then once you are able to do that, you become a hiero monk and you have achieved theosis.
That is super fascinating to me because another sort of aspect that gets talked a lot about in meditation, especially in neural imaging and psychology, is this transition from a state of mind to a trait. So like I think just about anybody, meditation isn't perfect for everybody, but just about everybody can sit down and maybe go through like a mindfulness workshop or like a Vipassana retreat or something and have these very like deep experiences of like inner peace, quietude. Their minds aren't racing anymore. Their emotions feel very like uh, they have an emotional equanimity about them. But then the moment they go back to work on Monday, it all flies to pieces again. So they went from a state, but they didn't develop this permanent mental trait. It's fascinating to me to hear that there is this anticipated framework among these monks, that there is a moment where you are putting in this effort to this cathartic stage, basically, where I love the idea of purifying the mind, like catharsis. It's almost like that would be a stage where like everything that gets in your way of focusing, that's where you need to settle that business. And then you get to theoria, where you're finally like starting to see sort of those experiences and states. And then theosis, where it seems like it's finally settling in a neuroplastic way. The idea of comparing that to becoming like Christ, I think that that's an interesting concept that might also be kind of foreign to a lot of Western Christian listeners. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about developing into a Christ through this practice?
Well, in what way? I mean, do you want me to talk about it metaphysically, or do you want me to talk about it? I mean, because there's a wide range of becoming like Christ. I mean, because that type of doctrine is in Western Christianity, but there is a very subtle demarcation between the way that Catholicism thinks about it and the way that Eastern Orthodoxy thinks about it, and a lot of it has to do with differentiation of metaphysics and especially their understanding of the incarnation, because
Can
again, like that's where it becomes paramount. So I guess
can you tell us a little bit
maybe
about that then?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I guess I answered my own question.
Yeah,
um
man, you're doing great.
so the idea of theosis goes back to Saint Athanasius of Alexandria with his famous maxim, God became man so that man could become God. Okay, and this is fourth century Christianity. This is when the creeds are coming into fruition. This is when the creeds are starting to become the definitive staples of Christianity, or at least they're trying to be. There's debates over whether or not that actually ever happened in the history of Christianity, but for the sake of argument, we'll say that it did. Um, that maxim becomes the seedbed, becomes the my mic there. becomes the framework to try to understand the incarnation of Jesus Christ, which is trying to understand Christ's nature. Who is Jesus Christ and what is he? And that doesn't get answered until the Council of Chalcedon, which is in 451 CE. So you have a whole bunch of creeds prior to that, which is answering all types of different controversies. Chalcedon comes around, which is the church answering, okay, who is Jesus Christ and what is he? Because we have this doctrine of theosis that comes from Athanasius of Alexandria and even other church fathers. I mean, but Athanasius is the one that's very famous because it's just very simply put. Everyone else is saying it too. I mean, it goes way back to Origen. It goes way back to Irenaeus. I mean, Irenaeus is against the heresies and why he's even combating the Gnostics has all to do with the idea of the incarnation and theosis. So, in other words, they're looking back on all this and saying we need to have a solid idea on how to understand the incarnation so that way we understand the idea of theosis. And what they ended up coming up with was Jesus Christ had two natures in one hypostasis. So he was both God and man in one being. Now, the Copts didn't like that. So the Coptic Christian Church was like, no. He's it's one hypostasis. It's two natures in one hypostasis. Very subtle, but it's the way of thinking about it is that you have man, God over here. So God, human over here that meet in Christ. Whereas the Copts thought about it in like, no, it's one hypostasis, and then there's God and man here, and then Christ just kind of melds it.
Almost like would you say almost like a spectrum? Like as opposed to
Yeah.
two distinct natures, it's like a spectrum. On one end is the human and the
Yes.
other end is the divine.
Yes.
I think that's really
Yes. It's a
interesting because
spectrum.
well, the way that you described this, especially you mentioned apophatic thought before, the idea that
Yeah.
like a lot of this centers on the idea that God can't be like intellectualized, but that God is experienced. I love that idea that God is primarily like this experience as opposed to a set of propositions, because it seems to me that these debates over like the divine nature of Jesus and the like take on a different tone almost when you focus on the experiential side of this. It's almost like it sounds to me almost like people are debating how do you explain the experience that you're going to have after prolonged practices like the liturgical practices as well, but also like hesychasm. Does that sound right?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Because again, the whole idea of partaking of the body and blood of Christ. I mean, like I said, theosis, achieving theosis. How does the human become divine if we don't understand who Jesus Christ is? Because that's why, it's like we can, like, some people might look at it and think it's just silly nonsense. It's like, well, actually, no, it's not, because it's actually looking at who are we in the face of the grand universe. We understand who Jesus Christ, like, we know that Jesus Christ is God, like, so that, like, that's how they conceptualized it. But now they have to ask the question, okay, if Jesus Christ is God and we're us, we have to understand the relationship between the two, so we understand who we are, and how we relate to our God. And that is a very important idea, especially when talking about cosmic, like just the idea of cosmic wholeness, being whole. So there's no confusion, there's no, I mean, like, there's no chaos in how humans are trying to understand and ground themselves in anything, right? So that's why this whole idea of the incarnation was so important. And so they ended up going, so the Copts ended up leaving because they made two different distinctions between, God's over here, man's over here, they meet in Christ. Copts say, peace out, we're going to go do our own thing. But the thing is the East and the West still don't quite agree on what that means. So even though the Copts leave and form their own synod, the East and the West, while still unified in one Catholic Church at the time, are still like, well, hold on, but we still don't quite know what this means. Because you have people like Maximus the Confessor, who still, and of course, even St. Dionysius, actually, he's not a saint. Let me backtrack on that for a second. Dionysius the Areopagite, he's not canonized because nobody has any idea who he is.
He
We just
should
have a
be.
whole bunch. Yeah. Well, well, and that's really why he's not canonized, is because we have no idea who wrote it.
Mm.
He's that's why they call him pseudo Dionysius, because he goes by the name of Dionysius, but we know that it's a pseudonym because he names himself after a disciple of Paul,
Mm.
who actually is a saint, but we know that whoever wrote this was not that guy. But Maximus the Confessor, who is a saint, did base a lot of his theology off of this guy's theology. And they formed the basis of a lot of Eastern Orthodox ideas of understanding the Incarnation. And Augustine becomes the basis of the Western understanding of the Incarnation. So this time becomes really pivotal in how the Incarnation is understood. And it's very, very subtle. Very subtle. Because with people like Maximus the Confessor and Dionysius, it's still, to call it monistic makes it seem like that they actually agreed with the cops when they didn't. It's more along the lines of that they are two separate things, but it was the fall that severed it.
Mm.
And then Jesus incarnating brought it back together into one whole.
Okay.
Okay.
So
So that's
so a sense of like
that's Maximus.
alienation.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So that's Maximus the Confessor and the Eastern way of thinking about it. Whereas the West maintains two completely distinct nodes of being that then bridge through Jesus Christ.
Interesting.
Okay.
Interesting. So it's almost like in the West that there's like this fundamental distinction between divinity and humanity, whereas in the East it's more like they go together, but that there's something within the human being that is keeping them separate, something that can
Which
be
is which was the fall, which
okay.
was the
And
fall
is
of Adam and Eve.
would it be accurate to say then that hesychasm is a way of attempting to eliminate that thing within human beings that like distinguishes the
So
human from the divine?
the atonement of Jesus Christ has already done that. But what hesychasm does is it's the discipline that allows one to take advantage of that atonement to then become divine. So it's one of those things where just because the bridge is built, you now have to cross the bridge, right?
Okay.
So grace is the ever-present divine in all of nature. It's there, it's present. Now you have to take advantage of it. Now you actually have to do something about it. So this is where the whole faith and works idea actually are completely melded in Eastern Orthodoxy. That's still present in Western Christianity as well. So this is where, like I said, it's subtle because they do preach the exact same thing, but so the mediation of Christ is just slightly different because, again, within Eastern Orthodoxy, the differentiation between God and man is just that, again, that idea of alienation, but they're still on one level playing field of being, whereas in Catholicism, they're two completely different things
This sounds to me a
that
lot
then
like
bridge in Christ.
this sounds to me a lot like we were discussing this before filming and everything too, but like the on Mount Athos, the monks there who were practicing hesychasm, there was a kind of controversy that was started by a monk named Barlam, I believe, and
So he
it
wasn't a
created a
monk.
debate. Oh, okay.
No, he wasn't a monk. He was I actually don't know who he was. I just know he was, just think of him as a very prominent Twitter Twitter troll.
He just kicked
I
the
don't
door in and said, "Here's how it's gonna go."
He just kicked the door in. So Barlam was born in Italy and was raised a Catholic. So this is in the 14th century for those that are unfamiliar with this controversy. So this is much later in Christian history. He's born a Catholic. He's raised in Italy and even went to school in Itoly and was taught Thomistic philosophy. So he was taught very much in scholastic philosophy and despised it because he felt that Thomas Aquinas, because his idea was that Thomas Aquinas felt that he knew way too much about God. He's like, you know way too much about this guy. How in the world can you possibly say that you know enough about this, about God? So he decides to jump on a boat and head east because he figures that that Eastern Christianity, especially with its much more apophatic stances, which is that the God is much more unknowable, that they might be able to help him with his quests in trying to understand what reality is, which is funny because it seems like he's a guy that already made up his mind. He was just looking for it. There you go. He's a Redditor. He's not a Twitter. He's not a
Yeah, there
Twitter
you
guy. He's a
go. There you
Redditor.
go. It's all coming together now.
He was just looking for an echo chamber for people to be like, yeah, of course. Anyway, so he goes to Mount Athos, which is an island off of the coast of Greece. It's a very large island, and it's strictly monks. The only people that live there are monks. It's for hundreds of years, it's just been a community of monks. They have their own councils, they have everything. They have their own government. It's everything. It's wonderful. So he goes there to try to learn from the monks about true apophaticism. And he runs into one of the leaders there, named Gregory Palamas. And Gregory Palamas says, no, God is knowable, but he's apophatic. So he kind of has this weird coincidentia oppositorum. And of course, Borlam's like, what in the world are you talking about? And so they start to, and so he leaves Mount Athos in a tirade. He's just furious. He's like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Because of course, the way that Palamas says it is he says it from experience that he knows God, right? He's like, I know God because basically I am God. And of course, to Barlam, that's like, what do my ears hear? He's like Caiaphas ripping his shirt
Yeah.
and leaves Athos.
Oh my gosh.
Um, you know, and so he leaves, and he starts writing Palamas saying, like, dude, like, you're way off base. Why are you saying all these things? Especially if you believe in like Maximus the Confessor and especially Dionysius the Areopagite. Like, how can you say all these things? And the responses to Barlaam have now become a very definitive treatise, called the Triads. So I think you were showing me them earlier. So these
Yeah.
triads are, Gregory Palamas's responses to Barlaam in defense of hesychasm and in defense of their practices and in how they know God, even though they maintain apophaticism.
That's a really interesting distinction because it's like the idea of, I mean, this could be just like the subtleties of language in general, but to know something intellectually and then to know something experientially. I mean, that makes a great deal of sense if you think about what you were talking about before with the repetition of the Jesus prayer meant to essentially lull the discursive analytical part of your mind into rest. So the perceptive part of your mind, the sensory part of your mind just is the only thing in operation. So you don't have like preferences going off and on, like saying yes to this, no to that. You just have this very oceanic, spacious sense of consciousness. That makes a lot of sense that Gregory Palamas would describe that as, okay, we are apophatic, but I do know God, like from experience, as you said. That's such an interesting distinction because I think that in the West we think of knowing God in a very intellectual sense, like a very propositional sense. I mean, I could be just speaking from, we both have grown up in a generally speaking Protestant influenced American culture where like a lot of that
Mhm.
that rubs off on us. But I find it fascinating that it's the experience of God that gets this intense focus. I'd like to focus in on like articulating what it means to experience God, because I think that to a lot of ears that might sound almost not solipsistic, but maybe escapist. Because
Mhm.
we think of God in such transcendental terms. So the idea of like experiencing God to some, I think, might sound like, oh, you sort of just disappear to this la la land that we don't know for sure. Sorry if that sounds very, very offensive, but you know what I mean? Like a state
No,
that
no,
we
totally.
have to rely on faith on. So can you tell us a little bit about the experience of God, what it means to when Gregory says he knows God?
Well, first of all, it actually is escapism. And I don't say that as a pejorative. I actually say it as it's an escape from what they see as the world in which we live in is the illusion. So it's actually escaping an illusion to reality.
Interesting.
So in other
Okay.
words, it's taking the pejorative way of viewing that and flipping it on its head, right? Because
Oh,
because
okay, okay.
because again, if Jesus Christ really is incarnate, and if Christ becoming, because if God reconnecting that bridge has now made grace in nature. That means that all things are now going to can become divinized. That means that us continuing in our fallen way is illusory and wrong because it alienates us from what is actually real, right? So that's
Okay.
how that's so that's that so in other words, Palamas would wholly embrace that escapism, but just say that actually what I'm escaping from is what is what you actually call real, because what I'm going to is actually real.
I actually really
Um,
love that. The idea that like the thing that you're escaping is not just like, but I guess to put a finer point on it, even the thing that they're escaping is not like the here and now reality of the world, but like the way that they experience the world. Does that sound accurate?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
this
yeah,
mental
exactly.
chaos. Okay, okay,
Yes.
that's
I mean,
awesome.
and even because even the communal way that they live, or even sometimes live by themselves, um, it's considered sacramental, right? It's like all of that is considered sacramental in the way that the way that they live, which is why I mean that's why I liked when you were talking about when you achieve illumination and you have to go back to your everyday life. Yeah, they totally understood that because they say that you can't achieve illumination and then go back to you can't achieve illumination and then go back to going back to making your bread or going back to cleaning your hermitage as if nothing had happened or just completely forgetting about it. It has to be
Mhm.
something that's ever present with you, right? So it's a reality that becomes sacramental in your everyday life, in your chores, in your serving other monks, in feeding the poor, in whatever it is that you do in your daily life. So that's why I like that demarcation that you make, because that's very central in hesychasm. And what was your question? I went on a tangent.
To be honest, I don't know if I remember what my question was. I just love what you're saying at this point.
Oh, because it's reality. It's like because then
Yes,
with
okay, yeah.
making that with grounding themselves in that sacramental and with making all that sacramental, it makes those the drudgery of chores
Mm.
grounded in a sacred reality. It's all sacred now because
That's a
I've achieved
weirdly
theosis.
that's a weirdly Zen thought, where it's like
Oh
Alan
yeah,
Watts. There's this
yeah.
quote from Alan Watts I love where he says people think spirituality is like cutting potatoes or like skinning potatoes and thinking about God, but the fact of the matter is that spirituality is just about skinning the potatoes, just like just being right there. I think this is interesting too, because Gregory Palamas, if I understand him correctly, he drew a distinction between like God's essence versus God's energies. And it sounds to me like that might actually be part and parcel of like the hesychast experience. Can you speak a little bit to that?
All right, you froze on me. Can
Oh,
you
yeah, yeah.
can you actually recap that? Sorry, and then you can
Yeah,
just
no
edit that
problem.
out and just pretend like nothing happened.
Oh no, man, I'm keeping that in. Yeah, so Gregory Palamas, if I understand correctly, makes the distinction between like God's essence and God's energies.
Yes.
And it seems like
Yes.
that could be pretty central to understanding this hesychastic experience. Could you speak to that distinction a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and let me know if I'm cutting out too. I don't
No
know if
problem.
it's
On my
if
end, you're
if my
perfectly fine.
internet's getting okay. Excellent. So this is where Gregory Palamas is able to kind of bridge the apophaticism uh, of his theology with being able to know God. As you said, essence versus energies.
Hmm.
So essence, what we would call being, is what God is, and that is essentially unknowable because it's the same as like I can't know Nathan because I can't bridge myself into Nathan's mind. Like I can't meld myself into Nathan's mind. Nathan and I, while we can share one field of existence, we are nevertheless separate. So, in other words, I will never be able to know Nathan's mind. I will never be able to know Nathan's essence. We will forever be separate. However, I can know Nathan's energies, which are things that Nathan puts out there. Like if he decides to tell me what he's thinking, his voice, if he were to slap me because I said something stupid, if I were to be weird and lick him, um,
There's a
or
reason we're doing this over Zoom, by the way.
yeah, I mean, body and blood of Christ, right?
Mhm.
But that those energies of Nathan, I can know very intimately, and that is where I can say I know Nathan, even though his essence will forever be a mystery to me. So the way that is very famous through Gregory Palamas's examples, that even becomes revitalized through the theology of Vladimir Lossky in his book, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, that again, people like Kallistos Ware pick up and again revitalize and make even more popular, is the idea of the sun. You have the sun as the essence, and then you have the rays of the sun as its energies, because the sun, we can't look directly in the sun or we will go blind, and we can't touch the sun or we will burn or we will be completely consumed in it. But the sun makes everything, it illuminates everything, it gives life to everything. We can see and feel its heat, we can see and feel its light, so everything that comes from the sun is there. It's still the sun. So we know the sun because of what it does, because of how it interacts with everything. We just can't know the sun itself in that intimate sense because of its nature, because of its essence.
Would that dovetail with what you were describing earlier about how the Christ event, like Jesus's atonement, that sort of suffuses nature with grace? Like that these energies are not just like this abstract thing you're experiencing, but the thing that God is putting out is experienced in, like you said, like everyday chores, even just like this monastic community, or just like the faces of people you encounter day to day. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, very much so. So this is why this theology of the incarnation is used in Palamas's example of the sun, because that idea of the sun and how the sun makes and creates life and sustains life is very, very much influenced by his idea of the incarnation, which again is also part of the triads as well. Because again, getting into the triads is getting into much more of the minutia, the minute theology of it. But of course, arguing from analogy is a much more easier way to make your point.
Oh yeah, all the time. I'm intrigued by this because it seems to me like the way that Hesychasm utilizes the Trinity is that like God the Father is this sense of transcendence that you, like you said, you can't know him on an intellectual level. Even saying like him would be like a concession, but that it imbues the world with a kind of value, like a homogenous value or divinity or energy, we could say. But that Jesus, going back to kind of what we were talking about before, Jesus stands as almost like this archetypal figure of the hesychast par excellence, the person that you're trying to become, the person who experiences those divine energies firsthand and immediately. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, because well, I don't think anyone ever pretends to understand the Trinity.
Fair enough,
Because
man.
again, being able to understand the Trinity in its totality would be like staring into the sun and being able to understand all of its parts.
Mm.
Even in hesychast theology, I mean that's like the final lines of Dante when he finally sees God, and he's like methinks I can see three parts, three men in one being, but he's not quite sure. That would I think that line in Dante, like just the mystery of the Trinity itself, but it also does, I think, very, very accurately parallel this sort of the apophaticism that's even central in the Trinitarian doctrine itself. Like the Trinity is not meant to be understood. That's where the strict apophaticism is like, nope, this is apophatic. Sorry, because understanding the Trinity in itself is understanding God's essence. But we can experience God's energies that come from the Trinity. We can experience I mean, we experience Christ, obviously, and even the apostles and the church afterwards experience the Holy Ghost all the time, which Saint Basil the Great, Saint Basil of Caesarea, wrote a beautiful treatise arguing for the divinity of the Holy Ghost, saying that this is something that we constantly forgot about, and that became a very definitive treatise in making sure that this idea of the Holy Ghost is God continued in Christianity. But again, it all comes back to just this this apophaticism, this cloud of illumination, the illuminative darkness, as Dionysius would put it.
I love that phrase. So I think that's really fascinating to me because I think about I think I'm probably more familiar with like the Western Christian side of things. Because I mean, you get books like an anonymous book like The Cloud of Unknowing, where it talks about something
Mhm.
very, very similar. Like when you relate to God, it's got to be in this like haze of not knowing what God is, and then you have to be in this haze of like forgetting the world around you. It's like it's like a thought experiment where like if you were to imagine being in the seat that you're in and not being able to remember where like how you got there, and then suddenly your attention is like investigating the world around you in this way more immediate sense, like where am I, what's going on. It seems to me that like hesychasm is pursuing a similar experience where you meet the world with this freshness and openness, as opposed to I think what a lot of people might associate with, and maybe understandably, but associate with like monastic traditions, which is like a very demarcated yes to this, no to that, stay away from me. I've got my group, and you're the impure, infection to it. But this is really interesting to me. The idea that God's energies or God's spirit or what have you are these concepts are being used to describe a meditative experience that I think, to be honest, sounds very, very familiar, albeit through different conceptual language, to people in Buddhism, people in yoga, people in Tantra, or even like I know that meditation is something that's been practiced all over the world. Like there's a Benedictine monk named Lawrence Freeman who I think that's his name, but he carried on John Main's work, another Benedictine monk that like sort of revived centering prayer in the world. And he was giving this workshop on centering prayer in Australia, and an Aboriginal person who was also a Catholic said like this sounds a lot like this practice we do called Dajiri, where we just sit by the river and we just mind the river itself. I think that's an incredibly interesting thing to see such a common mechanism among what seem to be ostensibly very different cultural and religious worldviews.
Well, and then you see people like Carl Jung, for example, who grounded a lot of his not just his theoretical framework, but even his therapeutic framework, not in meditative practices, and even in patristics, for example. Like he was very well versed in people like Maximus the Confessor and Dionysius. I mean, and then of course you have his Red Book, which is, those are all of his visionary meditative experiences that just
Oh
go
yeah.
way, way, way out there in a lot of ways that are absolute joy to read, at least for what I do.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call those hesychast myself. I wouldn't go that far, but nevertheless, when you read a lot of his commentaries on, like for example, his psychology of the mass, it is very heavily reminiscent of like Saint Maximus's mystagogy of the clergy, where Maximus is doing a Maximus does a very mystical interpretation of the liturgy and how it relates to this broader cosmic view of like the incarnation and contemplative practice, and how it all relates to, again, or how God became man so man could become God.
That's such a fascinating thing too. I love that you bring up Jung because like a lot of his work, like especially like Ion,
Mhm.
was like this very, very devoted to this concept that like Jesus as Christ is like the self, the capital S self that human beings can develop. This image of wholeness or like this way of articulating back to yourself like what you could become emotionally, mentally, psychologically, spiritually, if you prefer. It seems to me so interesting that the hesychasts were thinking in similar terms, that like for them Jesus was this not only this like this person who's doing something on their behalf, like on a metaphysical level, and not just a person to follow, but a person to like become. Like it seems like Jesus for them is like, you were talking about hero monks, like that Jesus is the hero monk that everybody is pursuing in that sense. I think
Yep.
that's such a fascinating interpretation. There's this therapeutic modality called internal family systems that I've been reading a lot about recently, where it's like it sees the human mind as like this conversation of a bunch of different sub personalities. Like some are trying to protect vulnerable parts of the other, some speak over the others really badly, and a lot of like mental and emotional turmoil ends up being something like really dysfunctional relationships between those sub personalities, in the way that you might have dysfunctional relationships between families. But Richard Schwartz, the guy who sort of pioneered IFS, he said that with a lot of his clients, they would talk about this thing that they would just call the self. That they said, like, no, it's not one of those parts that's talking to me. There's like this deep down part. There's this deep down layer of my mind that I just call, that's just me. That's just myself. And it seems to have this capacity to just listen to the parts of that maybe get drowned out, or to like be very compassionate toward those parts. That a lot of IFS ends up being like work trying to disentangle those very dysfunctional arguments even between subpersonalities in the mind, to get down to this deep down capital S self that can just listen, that can have compassion, and is very actively engaged with these other parts. That sounds to me so much like the hesychastic work of like catharsis, where you're sort of like digging past that chattering in the mind, and then theoria, where you're sort of like starting to recognize this deep down layer of yourself that can just enjoy the energies of God essentially that are in you and around you. And then of course theosis, where you're just part of it. I love that so much.
Oh yeah, it's great.
I mean, and one of the things about hesychasm too is that as beautiful as all of this is too, it's also um a lot of the beauty, and of course when I say this, I want to make sure I don't get misunderstood when I say it, because the process of becoming deified or achieving theosis is not an easy road, because I mean, and this is something that, I mean, like becoming, I mean, like earlier you were talking about a group of people that you knew that were like, how do I get initiated into hesychasm? And that may, and even for some of your listeners that are listening to this that are like, wow, this is really speaking to me and I may want to engage in this, I wanted to issue maybe not just that, not warning's a strong word, but it's more of like, um first of all, monks are very, very particular about who gets to undergo these types of practices.
Oh yeah.
There are a lot of people that get turned away because they're just deemed not, they just can't do it. It's like this, like these types of practices are, to call them rigid again is wrong, because as you say, it's actually trying to liberate. The problem is that we are making ourselves too rigid. And the problem is that a lot of people, and so with their concept of repentance and their concept of trying to liberate the self, become God, become, awaken the Christ within, there's a lot of people that can't do it. And so with that, it's a very hard process, very hard, very difficult. um it's I mean, it's like Dante having to go through the inferno. It's like, it's something that like some people just don't want to walk that road, and that's something that the hieromonks and the people and the spiritual guides who would walk you through this. I mean, first of all, you'd have to, for a lot of times, you'd have to become a monk. So let's put that out there.
Yeah, yeah, that's
If you
not
wanted,
optional.
if you wanted to practice hesychasm, almost guaranteed you'd have to become a monk. And with that comes a very disciplined, not rigid, but disciplined lifestyle. And that's where it gets really hard, because we're far too used to the lifestyles that we live in, maybe sometimes being too attached to other things that are not worthwhile, or in their eyes at least. And again, there are a lot of people that apply to become monks and they're just told flat out no. And so
it's
it's one of those
funny.
things.
I
Yeah.
I was just gonna say it's funny because a lot of folks, they don't seem to realize that this is very true in Buddhism and yoga and the like, where like they think that oh, in India and in Japan and in Korea they all meditate all the time. If you're a Buddhist, that's just part of it, and they don't realize that that's actually very exclusively monastic. Like the concept of how we've sort of disseminated like mindfulness based stress reduction and the like, and like meditation techniques through therapeutic contexts and the clinical contexts. That's an incredibly novel concept. It's also a very like recent one to open it up to just like people in general. It's fascinating to hear that that's the same story with Christian monastics, that this is seen as a very advanced technique, that this isn't just like a, okay, well, I do this every Saturday for about 10 to 15 minutes and then I got to go pick up my kids from soccer practice. Like it's such a demanding thing for sure.
It's a life. I mean, like these, like most of the time, these people that become hieromonks monks and achieve and get the highest schema. So after you've finally been mastered or achieve the and are granted spiritual mastery in hesychasm, these people are in their 80s. It's like these people usually enter the monastery in their, oftentimes, this isn't always the case. There's always exceptions. But most of the time, these people enter the monastery in their late teens, early to mid 20s, and they don't achieve this mastery until they're in their 70s or 80s. And then that's when they start, teaching other initiates. Sometimes they're younger, but not often. And
Yeah.
it's so that's where like, so that's why like sometimes these new age movements, which I don't view pejoratively, obviously, like I wrote my master's thesis on a guy who was very much a pioneer in the new age movement in Manly Palmer Hall, so I don't have any negative feelings towards new age movements. But one thing that they do when they do try to amalgamate these types of spiritual practices is that they do take away oftentimes the discipline that is associated with these, and that, hey, actually, yeah, you're not a monk. You're not living a monastic lifestyle. And better yet, yeah, like doing this for 10 minutes a day and then going and picking up your kids from soccer and then going out and getting Little Caesars for the night and drinking your Diet Coke and then watching your football team absolutely play terrible and and lose. That's not what these guys are doing, and they're not interested in that at all. And in fact, they would look at that with their noses absolutely turned up at it, just because they'd be like, what, it's a desecration.
Yeah,
It's like, what are
yeah.
you doing to our sacred practices?
Well,
you
it's such a
know
fascinating concept too that you can only see it when you've stripped away all the other stuff. Like the reason that they go into these monastic communities isn't just because like, all right, man, I don't want to watch any more football. I don't want to hang out with the boys anymore or anything like that. It's like, no, the moment you start stripping away all this transient material is when you start to see this like what they would describe, I guess, as this like eternal substratum underneath it. It's interesting too to me because I feel like that the way that some can trivialize the discipline and the intensity that's required for at least what these hesychasts have fully in mind, it parallels to me, I guess, a lot of what happens with mental health on the pop culture level too, where it's like, oh, I watched these TikToks and now I've diagnosed myself with something like dissociative identity disorder, like, and it's you go to an actual therapist or clinician to get screened and they say, no, you just, maybe you have OCD or you're very anxious or something like that. It's interesting to see. The reason I think that a lot of these monks take this so seriously is because you're dealing with things that aren't small potatoes. Like, even if we reduce this purely to human psychology, like you're dealing with the fundamental layers of how your mind processes your experiences. And that makes sense to me, that it would require so much, not only discipline, but like a very specialized environment, a very specialized set of experienced people. It's just, it makes a lot of sense to me, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's like I would dare somebody to do is just go try it. It's like go out and find a cave somewhere. Go out in the middle of the woods where you're completely alone. You're miles away from any roads. That way there's no cars, there's no nothing. The only thing you hear are the sounds of birds, maybe the sound of a creek, and you sit there for days with with your rosary, just
Mhm.
saying in your mind, and try not to be distracted.
Mm.
Try not to think about something else. And so that's why, like, the trivialization of it's just like, oh yeah, I just did my 10-minute meditation and then I went about my day. I'm like,
Hang on.
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well,
it yeah.
it's interesting too, because the wannabe therapist in me, and to be clear, I'm only an undergrad in psychology, folks, so this is not medical advice in any way, shape, or form. The wannabe therapist in me, though, too, is like, I really like the spectrum that is implied with this three-tiered system we talked about with catharsis, theoria, and theosis, that there's like the developmental model. So I mean, it's interesting because most definitely we are probably, you and folks like myself and yourself and the like, and our new age friends are probably not going to hit like theosis at any point in our lives, because we lack the specialized environment, the focused attention. Like, I'm thinking about the GRE right now, like not how to live in perfect harmony with everything that enters my field of perception. But it's in fact, it's a very disharmonious feeling, if I'm being honest. But it's interesting to me that like there's a lot of neural imaging studies that like they focus on like novices in meditation, specifically usually within like Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism especially. But they focus on novices, and then they focus on the specialized folks who have like tens of thousands of hours of doing exactly what you said, like sitting there just for days and don't let your mind wander. Um, but it's interesting that for a lot of people there is this sort of like all or nothing developmental state where it's like you do this for years and years and years, and then boom, suddenly you start to notice changes. But then there are also folks who start to notice gradual changes, like, oh man, I feel a little less lost in the laundry cycle of my own thoughts and emotions, even if we haven't quite hit the hero monk level. I guess I want to throw that out there because I love that as disciplined as these folks are, and I think that's an incredibly interesting, at the very least, if not admirable, pursuit, that they have this spectrum in mind, that like, yes, we're working towards something and there are way stations along the way.
And the thing to keep in mind too is it's like when they're doing this, they're not doing it. I mean, and this is something else that they would also be very adamant about if somebody's coming to their monastery to say, like, hey, I'd like to become a monk. One of the things that they will ask you is why? Why are you here? And if one of the things is like, because I want to achieve theosis, it's like, then you don't know what theosis is,
Hmm.
right? Because because why you achieve theosis at all is so that way because becoming like Christ means that you actually do what Christ did, right? You
Hmm.
learn
Okay.
to, I mean, kenosis, you learn to empty yourself for the benefit of all. And so if you're looking for this meditation for any sort of self-aggrandizement, for self-glorification, and of course when I mean self, I mean the little self, not the big S.
Yes. Yeah.
So like you're doing it so that way you can have these grand cosmic experiences. You're not doing it right in their eyes. It's like, no, 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 no. That's not why we're doing this. Like I don't go to my hermitage to pray because I try to for self-aggrandizement. I do it so that way when I come out of my hermitage, I can better serve my fellow monks, I can better serve my fellow man, and because I've achieved theosis, I'm now one with God, so that way I can now bring God to the rest of the world. Like that's their mindset.
That's fascinating to me. Like the idea that you're sort of reenacting in an analogous way, like how do I put this? One of the things that really fascinates me about like the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts is this running theme of the Spirit overshadows Mary. She conceives of the Messiah is born, and the Messiah does what the Messiah does. But that same Spirit also overshadows people that are following that Messiah, and that there's this almost like implicit way in which they themselves are conceiving that Messiah in themselves in their own lives. I love that idea that this is not it to me it parallels a lot of like modern conversations about meditation in the clinical setting versus like meditation where it comes from, because like a lot of folks, if you ask them like why would you meditate, it's like, well, I want to be, a little more, I want a little more emotional equanimity, I want to have a little bit, my mind races, I don't want my mind to race anymore. But if you ask like a monk, why do you, like a Buddhist monk, why do you practice meditation, they say it's because I'm trying to achieve nirvana, or like I'm trying to achieve enlightenment. There is this almost lost context where it's like it's not just emotional maintenance, where at least where these practices come from, it's not just emotional maintenance and regulation, it's an entirely fundamental change in the human mind. Really
And
love
that
that.
emotional, well, yeah, but then like that, and the emotional regulation, being able to be a bit more calm, working through problems better. It's something that they would look at and say, yeah, great. you know and that's not to downplay it, it's just like it's a secondary effect, but it's not what they're looking for. And I mean, it's like, and even in their eyes, it's like, if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to achieve it.
Interesting.
It's the whole idea of Christ saying, like, if you seek those who seek their life will lose it, and those who lose their life, shall find it, right? It's like, that's because, like, in their cosmological view, and especially in just their ideas of how contemplative practices work, if you're not doing it with that mindset, it's like you're not doing it to become divinized, you're doing it to better serve your fellow man, which is what makes you divinized.
I love that. I love it. So I want to maybe take us in one final direction before we close up here.
Yeah.
I'd like to discuss a little bit of perennialism if we can, because I know that comparative esotericism is a big part of your studies.
Mhm.
To me, just to kind of disclose for what I'm doing with this project with Mind Makes This World, I think that for me, something I take as axiomatic is that when it comes to things like religion, we're not describing like a top-down description of the universe. We're describing an outside or like an inside-out description of the universe, that I'm trying to describe to you an experience that I'm having, as opposed to like a set of propositions that are binding upon the entire universe in like an almost like scientific sort of way. Which is why I think it's so important to study these practices like hesychasm and the like, or like I said, I meditate quite a bit, but I want to be able to understand where these practices came from so I don't trivialize them, or so I can understand a little bit more about the people who constructed them and the like. But I also think that it's important to be able to develop maybe a conceptual landscape, if not a language, for discussing these views across traditional boundaries. So one thing I noticed a lot when I was researching hesychasm for this episode was that a lot of folks, especially Callistus Ware, were very insistent that this is not Christian yoga. And I think that what they were pushing back against was kind of that trivializing, reductive view that it's just yoga, but with Jesus in it a little bit. But perennialism, I know, and traditionalism, I guess, is maybe a distinct version of that as well. Can you speak to like frameworks that we could use that could help us to engage in dialogue with these various traditions without reducing them one to the other or the like?
So what I like is I love the perennialism of Frithjof Schumann, who was calling him Islamic would be incorrect, because while he was Muslim, he did incorporate he was very eccentric. He brought in like elements of the Native American sun dance, and he brought in a lot of different things to his religious practices, even ranging on uh, the erotic in some cases. But why he wrote a particular book that he expanded on even further in other books, but he wrote a book called Oh, dagnabbit, the name just escaped me. Hold on, let me look it up real quick.
That's all right. That happens to me all the time.
It was just in my head, and then it absolutely disappeared. Oh, okay. The transcendent unity of religions.
Okay.
Okay. So this is him arguing for a mode of perennialism. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't really advocate for the word perennialism, but he does use words like metaphysics or esotericism. That's the word that he uses, which for him would demarcate an inner shared reality. Now, of course, perennialism I don't think is a bad word myself, but I do think it does carry some baggage with it, such as Aldous Huxley using like his book, The Perennial Philosophy, which I don't have any qualms with myself. It's just that a lot of Huxley's claims doesn't really quite add up when you start bringing in other elements to it, particularly in the ancient world. His is a very modern take on religions and trying to bridge gaps, whereas Schuon is a bit more broad, especially with his reliance on people like Genon and Ananda Kumara Swami, who I think are a bit more precise and even a bit more leaning on the ancient rather than the current, because they were very anti-modern, sometimes to an extreme. But in the transcendent unity of religions, one of the primary arguments that he makes, or the analogies, if you will, is that religion is a language that people use to analyze and understand an experience or a reality. So that so the way that I like to talk about it is like, so I have like this water bottle, for instance. I just called it a water bottle, and we could call it's a blue water bottle. It's 32 ounces. And so we have all of our different sizes and descriptions for it, and all of our words and colors for it, and even our grammar for it. So we have a structure of words and grammar and sentence structure. So we have all of this to describe the water bottle that will help it for you and me as English speakers to understand it. Whereas someone in China would have no idea what we're saying, because they have a completely different set of structures, grammar, intonation. The phonetics are different. So the way that they would describe this water bottle would be very different. But we're still nevertheless describing the same thing. We're each looking at this water bottle. We're each experiencing a water bottle, but we're using very different rules, very different ways of experiencing it to analyze it. And so what Schuon says is that we each experience this inner reality, this inner esoteric reality, and then the language of religion, or the structures around working with it, grow from that. And so that's where you get Christianity. That's where you get all of these different aspects of it. And so they're all different languages. And so for him, arguing which religion is right is like arguing which language is right, which to him is a very silly question, because it's like what are you talking about? Which language is right? It's like some might be better at describing something than others, but that other language might be better at describing something else than the other language. So for him, it's when you're able to kind of not boil it, but when you're able to take everything in its totality and see its source, is when you're able to finally see that's the perennial truth. That's the esoteric kernel from which all things grow in his eye. And that he calls God, that he calls being, that he calls metaphysical truth. I mean, there's all types of words that he uses for it. But again, he also acknowledges that him calling him that is, again, just another structure around it. So it's very apophatic, kind of coming back to that. So he would look at Hesychasm and just kind of say the same thing.
Is this similar to the framework that you use in your research?
I would say so, though. one of the things, so I'll admit that I personally, in my academic work, do not hold a perennial worldview, just because it's not viewed very highly in
Hmm.
academic work. So so me personally, I guess you could say, in my own worldview and in my own spiritual worldview, yes. In my academic work, I take a much more what I call a liminal stance, which is where, because I do a lot of comparative work, and I mean, even when I'm working, I mean, I'll even talk about people like Shuan or Ganon or Kumaraswamy, or even other people like Jung, Campbell, Joseph Campbell, or whoever. And I take a much more, and what I mean by liminal stance is where I don't necessarily, it's where I adopt their stance so that way I can work with it. But then I'm also fluid enough to where I can also jump into something else that I'm comparing with it, and I can jump back and forth between each worldview. But I also am not, I'm kind of floating, if you will, between
Hmm.
differing worldviews, which
It's
is a
it's
worldview
interesting.
unto itself.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because it sounds to me a lot like how therapists will describe, at least modern therapists will describe working with clients and the like, is that there used to be this sort of model where we have the framework or we have the image of what the perfect mentally healthy person looks like, and our job is to just sort of usher you closer and closer to that image. And now it's moved to a slightly more pluralistic approach where we start to realize like, okay, well, maybe this modality works better for this person, but not necessarily for that person, and what this person's healthiest looks like is not necessarily what that person's healthiest looks like. I
Mhm.
think that's something I appreciate the most about the analogy you were mentioning before about language, about just like the idea of like what is this person attempting to express to me? Because I think that for me, one of the things that concerned me about Aldous Huxley, at least, I mentioned before this recording that I have been a part of like a perennialist traditionalist group on social media. I just sort of haunt and watch their things because it's a very interesting field for sure. But one of the things that concerns me is the same thing that a lot of people get into Advaita Vedanta concern me about, which is that they sort of assume that the perennial truth is that everybody is just a pantheist, if not maybe like just a monist. Like everybody's
Yeah.
secretly a pantheist, but they're too dumb to realize it. But like what we were talking about before with your research, your recent research into Nordic thought, that Aldous Huxley's model, for example, would not necessarily know how to engage like the concept of like Odin and the like. I think that's a very fascinating idea because it's just to me it's very important to develop a framework in which we can have these kinds of conversations without wiping out each other's uniqueness, but also learning from one another.
Yeah, it uses what one of my spiritual fathers. I've never met him. He died long before I was ever able to meet him, but his name was Algesius Divinus. He's a scholar of Platonism and theurgy. But his framework is called comparative hermeneutics, where he just views the way that people, again, it's very rooted in this type of thing, but it's taking a liminal stance in viewing the ways that people are analyzing thing as a hermeneutic, as a way of interpreting an experience, a way of interpreting a reality. So yeah, very much how I go about my work, and I guess even with psychology, very William Jamesian actually. Which it's like William James is starting to make a comeback. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, it really he his idea of like a pluriverse, for example, I think
Yeah,
is probably going to become very popular with a lot of folks, especially like newer people like myself who are maybe, just brand new to the therapeutic game, I guess. Um, well, I want to be respectful of your time, Brandon. We've been going for a lot, and I think we've covered a lot of really interesting ground here. I just have two final questions for you, and they're very brief. The first
yeah.
is, and this is going to be a broad one, so bear with me. Is there anything I did not ask you that I should have asked you?
No, honestly, I think this has been really thorough. I've really appreciated this. Um, no, I mean,
My ego is gratified.
I'm
Thank you.
the ego is gratified. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I would
have
not
been
be a good
fed.
monk. All
Nope.
right, and then the second question I have for you then is, if people want to find more of you, where can we find you?
Yeah, so I am actually in the middle of creating my own podcast series as well. I am not in competition with Nathan at all. That we are even we may even have him on as a guest in the near future.
I'd love
It's not
that.
in the current plans as of yet because we're still in development.
Oh, totally fine. Yeah.
Um, but a buddy of mine, Christian Van Dyke, he's a fellow student of mine at Claremont Graduate University. We are starting a podcast called The Analyst and the Fool. We're going to be discussing a lot of different ideas. Actually, we're going to be doing a series called Because I Didn't Read It, which is where we do a lot of kind of laid back, humorous summaries of a lot of the major philosophical works in Western literature. Like we're going to be starting doing works like Plato and Aristotle, and then of course jumping into things like Nietzsche and we might tackle Hegel, of course Marx. Going going all over the place in that spectrum. We'll even be doing a series talking about Mormonism and Mormon thinkers, trying to really tackle the pluralistic worldviews that people take, or the pluralism that is present within Mormon history, within the different ways that people have conceptualized Mormon history, Mormon thought, and Mormon theology. And then even just a more laid back series where we just kind of shoot the breeze and talk about whatever we're talking about. We've actually just had a guest on. We're going to be talking about cars, the future of automotive technology. We're going to be talking about college football. We're going to be talking about nuclear engineering. I mean, lots of stuff in the works. So if you wanted to contact me, you can reach out to our podcast website at theanalystandthefool@gmail.com. So you could just reach out to us there if you have any questions for me or Christian, or if you wanted to get into our podcast. We hope to launch sometime soon.
That's awesome, man. I am very excited for that. I think we've taken different paths, obviously, on a spiritual direction, or at least a religious affiliation direction. But I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on Mormon thinkers. I think that the conversations we've been able to share, albeit mostly until this point, mostly on Facebook and the like, they've really helped to shape the way that I still see Mormonism, the positive ways in which I see Mormonism, and even just the potentialities of it all. So I really want to thank you for that. I'm grateful to be able to have you as a friend, man. Also, I hope
Yeah,
you
no
know
problem.
that you have an open invitation to come back anytime. This was such a delightful conversation, and you have so much to say about such interesting things that I would be remiss if I did not invite you back, man. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I'd be more than willing to come back whenever you want me.
Awesome, man. Well, viewers, listeners, however you're consuming this podcast or YouTube channel or whatever it's going to be, thank you so much for your time. If you liked this, please leave a like or a heart or however you respond to this media. Hit subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, hit that bell so you can be notified anytime that we upload something new here. And other than that, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.